Hey guys, tonight we're diving into the world of medieval dating. Spoiler alert, it's not the fairy tale you're imagining. Picture this, you're in the 1300s, no TikTok, no Netflix, and definitely no romantic getaways. You've got one thing on your mind, surviving, and if you're lucky, finding someone to share your life with. But be warned, this journey's not as glamorous as it sounds. Dating in the Middle Ages wasn't about sparkly-eyed love at first sight. Oh no, it was about survival, alliances, and a whole lot of family interference. You probably won't survive this. But don't worry, we'll make it through together. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'm curious, where are you watching from tonight, and what time is it there? Let's see how far we're reaching across the globe now. Dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Dating in medieval times was like stepping into a twisted survival game where love took a backseat to social contracts, survival, and a huge chunk of family control. Forget picking someone based on shared interests or those cute, fluttery feelings in your stomach. Nope, your family, especially your father, had more to say about who you'd end up with than you ever would. And here's the kicker, you didn't have a say in the matter. You were basically a pawn in a much bigger chess match. In the Middle Ages, marriage wasn't about love, it was about alliances. Your family needed to ensure power, status, and maybe a little bit of land, so choosing a spouse was all about making sure you weren't marrying beneath your station. You, the unmarried woman or man, were just the vehicle for that, your feelings. Secondary, if not entirely irrelevant. Let's put it into context. Imagine you're a young woman of noble birth. You probably haven't even spoken to the guy your family has picked out for you. He could be the most charming man alive, or he could be a total tool. You wouldn't know until after the vows were exchanged. Is he good looking, you ask? Does he have a nice personality? You'll never know. In this time, your future wasn't yours to decide. And if you tried to argue about it, well, you'd be getting a solid lecture from your parents about duty. Historians still argue whether this arranged marriage system was more about ensuring stability, or just a way to get as much power as possible for the families involved. It's easy to paint medieval society as this rigid, heartless structure, but there were human beings behind it. Imagine the pressure to make sure you were marrying for the right reasons, and not because you were daydreaming about romantic notions. Oh, and the men didn't get off easy either. Don't think that just because you were a male, you were given carte blanche to pick whoever you wanted. You had responsibilities too. In fact, your future bride might have been picked for you long before you ever learned to ride a horse or hold a sword. Social standing and familial ties were at the core of these decisions. So, while today's dating scene might be all about swiping left or right, back then, it was more about swiping a good match for your family's social standing and hoping you could survive your future spouse. Love, well, that was a luxury, and for some, a far-off dream. Now, let's talk about the real currency of medieval romance. The dowry. It wasn't flowers, fancy dinners, or candlelit walks. No. It was cash or livestock, land, or anything that could be sold for cash. Picture this. You're the lucky guy or gal, depending on how you look at it, who's about to be married, and your partner's worth is entirely based on the dowry. This was no small thing. That price tag could determine whether or not your family would have to sell off some land or pawn off a few cattle to make the deal work. Imagine your dad walking up to your potential father-in-law, shaking his hand and saying, "All right, so let's talk dowry." You're sweating buckets, wondering if your dad is about to strike the deal of the century, or if he'll be pressured into coughing up a few of the family's prized assets. Nothing says romance like business transactions. Right now, you might be thinking, what's the big deal about a dowry? Well, the dowry was the primary way a woman's glee. Family compensated the man's family for taking on the risk of marrying her. It wasn't just a gift, it was an essential part of the marriage agreement. It helped establish the man's claim on his new wife's labor, property, and any future children. This wasn't just about some pre-wedding cash flow. The dowry was a mark of social status, a bargaining chip in the family alliance game. And if you were the poor soul paying it, it's a source of long-term financial stress. Historians still debate whether dowries were a necessary evil to maintain, social order, or just another form of oppression. Some argue that the dowry helped elevate women's roles within the household, ensuring that they wouldn't be completely destitute if their marriage fell apart. Others claim it was a way of reducing women to commodities, something to be bought and sold. For those with a bit more wealth, this arrangement worked out. But for lower classes, it could mean a lifetime of financial ruin. If a family didn't have enough livestock, land, or money to offer, it could lead to a broken engagement, or worse, social embarrassment. In some cases, the dowry was so high that marriages could be delayed for years sometimes until the father of the bride could scrape together the necessary resources. Imagine being in a situation where your future happiness hinges not on your love for someone, but on your father's ability to secure a substantial sum to hand over. If that wasn't pressure, I don't know what was. And this didn't just apply to women. The dowry system sometimes worked the other way around. In some cases, the groom's family would offer the bride's family a dowry, particularly in cases where the groom had assets that would contribute to the union. There was no escaping the financial entanglements that shaped the very foundation of medieval relationships. And don't even get me started on what happened when a marriage wasn't working out. Divorces were rare, and the dowry was the least of your worries. It wasn't just about love or happiness. Marriages had to work for the entire family, and anything less was a potential disaster for the community's social standing. Now that we've got the dowry and family control out of the way, let's talk about a little thing called age, specifically how early people were expected to get married. Imagine this. You're about 12 years old, and suddenly you find yourself staring down the reality of marriage. No, this isn't a weird medieval fever dream. It was reality for many during the Middle Ages. Marriage in medieval times wasn't about waiting until you found the right person at a cozy cafe. It was about securing your place in society and fast. By the time girls hit puberty, they were considered eligible for marriage. Yes, puberty. We're talking about ages as young as 12 for girls, and sometimes even younger for those from wealthy families. They were seen as fully capable of running a household, birthing children, and raising them. And let's not forget the men. While they often married later than women, they were still expected to marry by their early 20s at the latest. If you didn't, you were considered past your prime. And here's the kicker. None of this had anything to do with love. The idea of a romantic adult relationship developed over time didn't fit into the medieval mindset. Women were, for the most part, seen as the property of their husbands, and marriage was less about personal connection and more about familial duty and economic necessity. No time for the whole getting to know each other thing once you hit your marriageable age. It was go time. Historians still argue over the emotional toll this early marriage age had on individuals. Some believe it was simply part of the harsh survivalist mentality of the time, where reproduction was crucial for the continuation of society. Others point to the emotional and psychological strain placed on these young individuals, who were thrust into the responsibilities of adulthood long before they were mentally or physically ready. For men, there was also pressure to marry young. Whether it was to keep up with societal expectations or secure an advantageous match, men in their late teens or early 20s faced similar pressures. The concept of love had no place here. In fact, many men didn't even have a say in their bride's age or background. It was about family alliances, social standings, and preserving the family legacy. If you think this sounds harsh, you're right. But to put it into perspective, if you didn't get married young, you ran the risk of being labeled undesirable or too old for marriage. You might also face pressure to produce heirs or face being ostracized. It was a harsh reality one. That didn't offer much room for individual choice, especially for women. And then there's the romance part of it. Imagine being forced into a marriage at the age of 12 or 13, possibly with someone you barely knew or liked. The idea of growing old with someone, sharing intimate moments, and building a life together was likely a distant fantasy, one that wasn't often afforded to the majority of medieval people. But if you managed to survive your marriage to someone you barely knew at a tender age. There was another interesting facet of medieval dating that might still send shivers down your spine: the chastity belt. Ah, the infamous chastity belt. You've probably heard of it, and if you haven't, well, brace yourself for one of the most bizarre inventions in history. Medieval times weren't just about chivalry and knights in shining armor. No. The real dark side of courtship involved a contraption designed to keep one thing safe: a woman's virginity. This wasn't about protecting her dignity or preserving the sacred bond of marriage. This was all about control, possession, and, let's face it, fear. Picture it. You're a woman, married off at 13, remember? You're still just a kid, and the next thing you know, your husband slaps a metal contraption on you, literally locking your most private parts away under the guise of protection. Welcome to medieval romance. The chastity belt was designed to ensure that a woman remained pure until the wedding night, or perhaps even beyond, depending on the whims of her male guardian. Now, we don't know for sure whether chastity belts were as widespread as historical fiction suggests, but they do have a fascinating and disturbing place in history. Some experts argue that the use of chastity belts was exaggerated, that they were more of a myth than reality. Others believe they were used occasionally, especially by the upper class or aristocracy, to prevent infidelity among their wives while they went off to war or business ventures. Regardless, the fact that this idea was even considered normal says a lot about medieval views on gender, sexuality, and marriage. Historians still debate whether chastity belts were genuinely used during the Middle Ages, or if their existence has been blown out of proportion. Some scholars claim that they were more of a theoretical device or a medieval curiosity than something people actively used. Others argue they were more of a sexual control tool, a symbol of patriarchal dominance. What's clear, though, is that the idea of locking up women's sexuality was a prevailing one in the minds of many medieval men. And that, in itself, is deeply unsettling. If you think this was just an extreme case, think again. Gender roles in the medieval period were rigidly defined. A woman's body wasn't her own. It was the property of her father, and later, her husband. These societal expectations extended to all aspects of a woman's life, including sex, which was seen as a duty, a means to produce heirs, and an act governed by the rules of religion and family. For men, there were far fewer restrictions. Though they were expected to control their urges and respect their wives, less, of course, they didn't. Infidelity was a common issue, especially among the wealthier classes, and the penalties for being caught could range from social ostracism to brutal punishment. But, strangely enough, if a man was caught committing adultery, the social consequences often weren't as severe as they were for women. So, as weird as it sounds, the chastity belt was just one of many ways society tried to control women's bodies and sexuality. It's almost as if medieval romance was less about loving someone and more about possessing them body, mind, and soul. And let's face it, if your romantic relationship starts with something as medieval as a chastity belt, you're probably not going to make it to the fairy tale ending. Now, let's shift gears a bit. This wasn't just a time of keeping women chaste. Medieval society had strict rules about premarital sex, okay? And those rules were enforced in ways that would make your head spin. Alright, let's move on from the whole chastity belt fiasco and dive into the next medieval dating disaster: premarital sex. You might think that in a time where survival was key, people would be more focused on, well, surviving. No. The church had quite the interest in your love life, and if you weren't living by their strict rules, you were headed for trouble. The medieval period wasn't exactly a time of free love or casual flings. In fact, if you had the audacity to engage in premarital sex, you could find yourself in a heap of social trouble. The church had an incredibly firm grip on matters of morality, and getting caught in the act of premarital intimacy was a huge scandal. We're not talking about being caught with someone of the opposite sex. No, this was the kind of scandal that could make you the laughingstock of the entire village or, worse, put your life at risk. Here's the thing: medieval people didn't exactly have modern methods of birth control, so there was a lot riding on sexual activity. If a woman got pregnant before marriage, she was in deep, deep trouble. Forget what you've heard about medieval women being liberated in some way if you were an unmarried woman and found to be pregnant. Your life was about to get very complicated. In some cases, the penalty for premarital sex was outright punishment, public shaming, forced penance, or even expulsion from the community. These were serious consequences that could haunt you for the rest of your life. Historians still debate the extent of how harsh these punishments were, whether they were more of a societal stigma or something actively enforced by the church. Some scholars argue that the church's role in medieval sex and marriage was largely based on controlling populations, ensuring the sanctity of marriage, and keeping moral order. Others suggest that the church was overzealous, imposing rules that didn't always align with the everyday realities of life for peasants or nobility. Let's not forget the consequences for men either. Men were often off the hook when it came to premarital sex, at least in terms of punishment. For men, engaging in sexual activity before marriage could occasionally result in fines, but rarely the social stigma a woman would face. Meanwhile, for a woman, premarital sex was more than a moral failing, it was a societal offense. One that could tarnish her reputation, damage her family's honor, and destroy any hope of a future marriage. But here's where things get really interesting. If a man and woman got caught having premarital sex and it was discovered that she was pregnant, the consequences could include forced marriage. Yep, that's right. In some cases, if a woman found herself pregnant without the blessing of the church, the couple was practically forced to marry. This wasn't about love, it was about protecting the family's honor and making sure that the child was born into the legitimacy of marriage. Now, it's worth noting that in some parts of Europe, betrothals were pretty much the same as marriages. That meant that if you were engaged, the pressure was on to behave as though you were already married. Sex before the wedding wasn't exactly uncommon, but again, it wasn't about romance. It was about proving your family's good faith, maintaining honor, and avoiding disgrace. And here's the kicker: sometimes these forced marriages, the result of illicit sex, ended up being much more public than anyone had imagined. Imagine getting married under the intense gaze of your family and community, all while being forced into a union that was only brought about by scandal. That's not a recipe for a happily ever after. But hey, at least there was one group that was trying to make things better, or so it seemed. The Pope. You'd think that with all of these rules and regulations, the church might have a better grip on things. But as we'll see next, the Pope's influence on love and marriage might not have been the blessing it appeared to be. Now that we've survived the wrath of premarital sex laws, let's talk about the Pope's influence on your love life. Yes, you read that right. When you think about dating in medieval times, you probably don't picture the church having a say in who you could or couldn't marry. But trust me, the church wasn't just about keeping the peace and spreading good vibes. It had a significant hand in regulating all things romance. And it wasn't afraid to put its stamp on your relationship, whether you liked it or not. The Pope, along with the broader church, controlled marriage laws in medieval Europe. And that meant that your love life wasn't just about what your parents thought or who you were emotionally invested in. No. The church had a full-blown monopoly on marriage. From deciding whether your relationship was legitimate to telling you when you could or couldn't marry, the church was in charge of nearly every aspect of this process. For one, marriage wasn't seen as a personal decision. It was a sacrament. It wasn't a casual partnership. It was a holy union in the eyes of God. And you, as the lowly peasant or nobleman, had to follow the rules of the church. The Pope and other high-ranking clergymen had the final say on whether a marriage was valid. And that meant that a lot of love stories were in the hands of someone who had never met the couple and probably didn't care much for their romantic connection. But the church didn't stop there. It also had something called marriage bans, a system that required public notice of a couple's intent to marry. Imagine the nerves you'd feel as the whole town learned about your upcoming wedding in a world where rumors could ruin your life. You'd have to post an official announcement in church. And if anyone had a problem with the match, say you were already married or related to the person, you'd be in trouble. No sneaky elopements here. Historians still debate the church's role in regulating marriages, whether it was about preserving the sanctity of love or keeping a tight grip on social order. Some argue that the church was concerned about legitimacy and preventing any so-called illegitimate children from being born. Others suggest the church was more interested in controlling the population, ensuring that marriages were arranged for the good of the community, not necessarily for the happiness of the couple. Even if you were lucky enough to find someone you cared for, remember, this wasn't the norm. If you didn't follow the church's rules, your union could be considered illegal. Oh, and don't think divorce was an option. Divorce wasn't a thing in medieval times. If you ended up marrying the wrong person or, heaven forbid, had a rocky relationship, were stuck. The church only allowed separation in cases of adultery or abuse, and even then, it wasn't a clean break. The idea of being stuck in a miserable marriage for life was a grim reality for many medieval couples. But here's where it gets even more complicated. The Pope also had the power to annul marriages. That means the church could declare your marriage null and void if it didn't meet their standards, even after you'd been married for years. Think about the chaos. You could have kids, a house, a life together, and then, just like that, the church says, nah, your marriage never existed. Imagine having your whole life turned upside down because of a church decree. You could be left without a partner, without property, and potentially without a future. The Pope's decisions could be absolutely devastating, and don't even get me started on consanguinity, the church's fancy word for being related by blood. If the church deemed you too closely related to marry your beloved, even if you didn't know it, they'd be able to step in and call off the whole thing. They'd find every possible excuse to keep you from marrying the wrong person, whether that meant a family member you didn't even know you were related to, or someone who was considered imperfect in their eyes. So while you were hoping for a happily ever after with your true love, the church was holding the reins and deciding if your union was legitimate. Romance. Nah, that was just a backdrop to social and religious obligation. Next up, courtship rituals. Hold on tight, because things aren't about to get any easier. Get ready to find out how you could court someone, but only under the watchful eyes of chaperones and the strict rules of propriety. Now that we've waded through the church's tight grip on your romantic future, let's dive into courtship rituals. If you think dating today is complicated, just wait until you hear about the hoops people had to jump through back in the Middle Ages. Courtship wasn't the private candlelit affair you might picture. Nope, it was public, formal, and watched closely by others. In fact, you were never really alone with your potential matat, at least not in the early stages. Privacy. That was a luxury for the rich. Courtship was more like a performance, one that required a chaperone, usually a parent or elder relative whose primary job was to make sure no funny business happened. There was no sneaking off to the movies, no texting cute messages in the middle of the night. Nope, if you were lucky enough to have an arranged meeting with your prospective partner, you had to do it in front of an audience. Imagine trying to have an intimate conversation with someone when an older relative is standing right there, probably making awkward small talk. Not exactly the stuff of romantic dreams, is it? In these times, courtship wasn't just about getting to know someone. It was a public display of your worth. You had to prove you could perform your societal roles well, whether you were a potential spouse or a future parent. Public performances of romance where your intentions had to be as clear as possible were key. The problem was, if you didn't follow the rules of propriety, or worse, your chaperone didn't approve, your chances of getting married to that person were basically zero. Courtship rituals varied by social class. But one thing was the same for everyone. You had to maintain decorum. There were strict rules about how and when you could talk to someone of the opposite sex. For example, touching was completely out of the question unless you were already engaged or married. Holding hands was a risky move and reserved for more serious relationships. Kissing, absolutely off limits unless you were actually married. The tension between what was permissible and what was not, must-have, made medieval courtship feel like walking a tightrope. Historians still argue about how strict these rules were in practice. Some suggest they were enforced with military precision in upper-class circles, while others believe that in lower classes there was a bit more room for spontaneity or perhaps a bit of cheeky rule-breaking. However, even in those situations, there was a deep-seated fear of social repercussions. A misstep could not only ruin your reputation, but it could also hurt your family's standing in the community. What's even more fascinating is that the idea of courtship was heavily influenced by religion. It wasn't just about proving your worth as a partner, it was about proving your worth as a moral individual. Your behavior, your speech, your actions, everything was scrutinized to ensure that you were a suitable match in the eyes of both your community and the church. And if you think modern dating apps are invasive, well, medieval courtship took things a few steps further. Not only were you watched, but your family was also deeply involved in the process. If you had to meet your match through an intermediary, like a go-between, you'd need to worry about how they presented you. After all, if you wanted a positive match, the reputation you built up in your village was everything. Getting caught in a misstep could ruin all your chances of ever marrying the person you wanted or, even worse, any future romantic prospects at all. Now, if things went well during the courtship, you might finally be able to get engaged, but that came with its own set of rules and problems. Engagement wasn't exactly the blissful time of happily planning your wedding day. In medieval times, being engaged meant that everyone knew the couple was spoken for, but it also meant you were expected to prove your commitment in very public ways. If the courtship had been public, engagement was even more of a spectacle. If you hadn't yet made it official with the church, you were still under scrutiny and at risk of scandal if things went wrong. But this was still just the beginning of the marriage journey, and sometimes the next part of it could be a bit deadly. Yes, you guessed it, poisoned love. We'll explore how the Middle Ages were full of cases where love, or at least the relationships that were supposed to resemble love, had a very dark side. All right, hold on to your hat, because we're diving into the poisoned love of medieval romance. In a time where love was really about property, power, and survival. It shouldn't be a surprise that some relationships took a truly dark turn. If things weren't going well, and love wasn't exactly blooming the way it was supposed to, There were certain ways to solve the problem, and we're not talking about talking it out over a nice dinner, no. No, this is the era of poisoning now. We can all agree that love can get messy, but in medieval times, it was incredibly common to use poison to resolve issues that couldn't be solved by talking or just breaking up. People didn't have therapy, and divorce was, for the most part, illegal or at least socially taboo. So, when marriages went sour, or when a love affair went wrong, poisoning could sometimes be seen as the only option. It sounds like something straight out of a soap opera, right? But it was very real. One famous case involves Catherine de' Medici, the Queen of France, who allegedly used poison to deal with both political and personal issues. Poisoning wasn't reserved for royalty, though. It wasn't uncommon for people of all social classes to use poison to get rid of a spouse they no longer wanted, or to protect their interests in relationships that went awry. And considering the widespread availability of poisonous substances thanks to a thriving market in herbs and potions, a well-timed dose could be hard to detect. Historians still argue about how widespread poisoning was, but there's no doubt that it had a presence in medieval life. It was discreet, it was effective, and it was often seen as a necessary evil. Marriage was meant to be permanent, and if you found yourself stuck with someone you didn't want, poisoning could be the way to end it without facing the social repercussions of divorce or breaking the vows of the church. Even more horrifying was the fact that these poisons were sometimes concocted using common herbs and plants, making them difficult to trace. People weren't just using complex alchemical potions. They were using things like belladonna, deadly nightshade, arsenic, or mercury substances that could be slipped into food or drink with little risk of detection. But poisoning wasn't just the weapon of those who felt trapped in unhappy marriages. It also played a significant role in the world of royalty and political intrigue. Rulers often feared betrayal from those closest to them, so political poisoning was a common tool for eliminating rivals. If your love affair or marriage didn't go as planned, a little dose of poison could get rid of the problem for good. Now, let's take a step back for a second. Just imagine living in a world where even your closest loved one's your spouse. Your family might be plotting behind your back, considering how they could fix things with poison. Can you imagine how paranoid and fearful you'd be? In a society where trust was fragile and alliances shifted constantly, love had a sinister, deadly edge. But this wasn't just about killing off an inconvenient partner. Poisoning could also be used as a method of revenge in cases of unrequited love, unfaithfulness, or betrayal. People had a lot of power over one another in these toxic relationships, sometimes too much. The fact that poisoning was considered a solution to relationship issues paints a pretty grim picture of medieval romance. And this wasn't just an isolated phenomenon. Many medieval writers and chroniclers documented instances of poisoning, sometimes detailing the kinds of people who were suspected of being involved in these deadly acts. Not surprisingly, women were often blamed for poisoning, given that they were seen as more emotionally volatile than men and were thought to have a natural affinity for herbology and potions. Of course, men were just as involved in these deadly schemes. But the societal narrative often placed the blame squarely on women's shoulders. The fact that poisoning was so prevalent speaks to the power dynamics of medieval relationships. Love, if we can even call it, that was about manipulation, control, and survival. If love didn't serve its purpose in the social contract, the consequences could be deadly. But if poisoning didn't end a marriage or romantic relationship, the plague certainly had a way of stepping in. Yep, we're about to take a look at how the Black Death affected romance in ways you never expected. Spoiler alert, it wasn't a happy story. Let's shift gears and talk about the plague, because nothing says dating disaster quite like a pandemic. You thought modern dating was tough? Try living through a global health crisis where everyone you loved could be wiped out in a matter of weeks. The Black Death, the plague that ravaged Europe from 1347 to 1351, didn't just kill millions of people, also turned medieval dating upside down, with love and courtship tossed aside in favor of survival. Imagine this. You're in the middle of a growing love story, and things seem to be going all right. Sure, there are some awkward moments, remember the whole chaperone thing? But you're getting to know someone, maybe even building a future. But then, out of nowhere, the plague strikes. Suddenly, everyone you know is getting sick, and there's no way to predict who will make it through. One day, you're holding hands with someone, and the next, they're coughing up blood and you're frantically trying to stay away. The Black Death wiped out up to 60% of Europe's population, and as much as it's remembered for its terrifying death toll, it also wreaked havoc on personal relationships. Marriage and family life became secondary to the fight for survival. Love was no longer a priority when people were desperately trying to avoid getting sick or trying to bury their loved ones before they too succumbed to the disease. During the plague, courtship was out the window. Instead of having public dates or private moments of affection, people were focused on one thing: staying alive. And here's the kicker, because the disease was so contagious, social distancing without the term for it became an immediate reality. People avoided one another like the plague because, well, it was. And those once precious moments of courtship turned into silent prayers for good health. Historians still debate the long-term social impacts of the Black Death. Some argue that it accelerated social mobility with so many people dying. Surviving members of the lower classes had the chance to inherit property and move up in the world. Others believe it made people more mistrustful of one another, knowing that anyone could be a carrier of the disease. Either way, it was a nightmare for anyone who was trying to get a love life off the ground. But it wasn't just the sick that had problems. The impact of the plague stretched far beyond the personal. The massive death toll meant that there was a severe shortage of workers. So men and women from all walks of life suddenly found themselves in positions of economic power. While this could potentially offer more choices in marriage and relationships, it also meant that romantic gestures like courting were overshadowed by more immediate concerns: finding food, securing shelter, and making sure you didn't catch. Whatever was wiping out half of Europe, there were also religious implications of the plague. The church, already deeply entrenched in regulating love and marriage, became a beacon of hope for many people who turned to it for spiritual solace. But for others, it became a symbol of despair. Couldn't the church protect them from such a destructive force? This led to a rise in blame. People started to associate the plague with divine wrath, and some even saw the disease as punishment for their sinful ways. So you can imagine how much the idea of love, courtship, or even a stable family life mattered, when you were wondering if you'd even survive to see tomorrow. But here's the twist. The aftermath of the Black Death didn't just end in heartbreak and death. In fact, it opened up a new chapter for dating, one where the rules of the game started to shift. Those who survived the plague started to look at life and love differently. There was a renewed focus on personal connections because, frankly, life was too short. And so, the social dynamics of marriage and dating began to change, although, as we'll see, the new rules weren't necessarily any less complicated. But before we get there, let's talk about some of the bizarre courtship customs that defined/conned medieval romance, just in case you thought things couldn't get weirder. As if the plague and the church weren't enough, medieval courtship also came with a bizarre set of customs that would leave modern daters scratching their heads. If you thought the idea of getting to know someone was awkward in medieval times, wait until you hear about some of the odd rituals that were considered normal. These customs were often tied to symbolic gestures, social status, and religious beliefs. If you wanted to prove your love, you didn't just send a sweet note or give flowers. You had to perform. Let's start with one of the most infamous courtship practices, the love song. No, not like the romantic serenades you might see in modern day movies. This wasn't about singing under the window in the middle of the night. Oh no, in the medieval world, love songs were much more formalized and public. If you wanted to win someone's heart, you had to compose a song or poem, often filled with grand, flowery language, and then perform it in front of a crowd. Imagine serenading someone in the town square with all your friends and family watching, waiting for your love interest's reaction. The pressure would be enough to make anyone break into a sweat. Historians still debate how seriously these performances were taken. Some argue that they were viewed as an art form, respected for their cultural significance, while others suggest they were simply another way for families to display their wealth and social standing. Either way, love songs weren't private moments between two people, they were public spectacles. Now, what about the ritual of the gift giving? It wasn't just about flowers, chocolates, or something cute from the store. Medieval gift giving was a ritualized affair, often laden with symbolism. If you were a man courting a woman, you'd give her gifts that demonstrated your wealth and status. Think along the lines of elaborate jewelry, precious metals, or even land deeds. It wasn't just about impressing her with your generosity. It was about proving you could provide for her and her family. Women, on the other hand, would sometimes reciprocate by giving gifts that represented their fertility and ability to bear children. Because, in the end, marriage wasn't just about love, it was about securing the family line. But it didn't stop there. Public declarations of love were common in medieval courtship. If you truly had your eye on someone, you couldn't just flirt in private. No, you needed to make your feelings known in front of the community. This could take the form of a grand proclamation, often made during a church service or community gathering, where everyone would hear how you felt. But, as you might expect, these public declarations were risky. If the woman didn't feel the same way, or worse, if her family disapproved, you'd be in for some serious public embarrassment. Nothing says romantic gesture like a failed proclamation that turns into a public shaming. And if you thought all of this was a bit too formal, let's not forget about the quirky, courtly love traditions that took root among the nobility. These customs were often tied to the ideals of chivalry, and they took courtship to an almost unattainable level. One of the most famous examples is the concept of courtly love, an idealized form of love that existed mostly in the world of knights and ladies. It involved knights performing heroic deeds for their ladies, who were often unattainable and married to other men. So, just a bit of emotional anguish and yearning to spice things up. These knights would often vow eternal loyalty to a lady and dedicate their feats of valor to winning her favor, even though the relationship was never meant to be physical. This idealized and often unattainable form of love was celebrated in literature and songs, but had little to do with real-life relationships. As strange as it might seem, these courtly love traditions were a direct contrast to the pragmatic nature of most medieval marriages, where alliances were made for power, wealth, and land, not for true love. In this strange paradox, the nobility glorified an unattainable, almost impossible form of romance, while still engaging in highly practical and often transactional relationships. So it wasn't just about getting to know someone, finding common ground, and connecting emotionally. Medieval courtship was about performing for your community, proving your worth, and sometimes risking public humiliation if things didn't go as planned. With all of these weird and wonderful rituals, it's no wonder that many people were looking for something more than just the typical courtship process. But as weird as courtly love and public proclamations were, there was one thing even more dangerous lurking in the shadows of medieval romance: the witch trials. And yes, the accusation of witchcraft could be a relationship killer in more ways than one. Now, let's talk about something that could put a serious damper on your medieval love life: the witch trials. No, I'm not talking about some distant, spooky Halloween tale. This was a very real threat to anyone whose love life or social status was considered even remotely suspicious. During the medieval period, love and magic were tightly woven together. And if things didn't go well in a relationship, it was far too easy to blame some form of dark magic for your problems. Imagine this: you're happily or at least reluctantly married, and your partner suddenly starts acting distant or strange. Before you know it, rumors swirl that you've cursed them or used magic to bend them to your will. Maybe you've been accused of using a love potion to ensnare someone's affections. The next thing you know, you're caught up in a witch hunt. Your love life turning into a full-fledged legal disaster. The idea that magic could influence love was widespread. And so was the belief that witches, often women, were responsible for using that magic to manipulate relationships. The medieval witch trials targeted those accused of casting spells or performing rituals that caused harm or, more commonly, disrupted the social order. A love affair gone wrong, a marriage filled with strife, or a failed courtship could easily be blamed on witchcraft. Accused individuals were often subjected to brutal interrogations, with confessions extracted through torture. Historians still argue about how many people were actually executed for witchcraft in the medieval period versus the later early modern witch hunts. But one thing is certain: accusations of witchcraft were serious business. The power of rumors and superstition overrode any sense of logic, and a woman, or sometimes a man, could easily find themselves accused of practicing dark magic, simply because their love life was seen as unusual or inconvenient. What made matters worse was that accusations of witchcraft weren't just about causing harm, they were also deeply tied to religious fears. The church was incredibly influential in shaping how relationships were viewed, and anything that disrupted the natural order of marriage, courtship, or love could be construed as the work of the devil. In fact, the church itself often supported witch trials, believing that magical influences, especially those tied to love and lust, were dangerous to both the soul and the social fabric. But even if you survived the witch trial, you were never really free from the social stigma. Once accused of witchcraft, your reputation was forever tainted, and your romantic prospects, well, they were probably gone too. No one wanted to marry or associate with someone who was rumored to practice dark arts, regardless of whether or not the accusations were true. The terrifying part was how easy it was for someone to fall victim to these trials. The slightest suspicion could lead to accusations, and often, it didn't take much more than a spurned lover or an unfortunate series of events to trigger the suspicion of witchcraft. If a marriage fell apart, or a child died unexpectedly, or you simply didn't fit the mold of what society considered acceptable, you could quickly find yourself in the hot seat. But there were some who used the fear of witchcraft to their advantage. Love potions, charms, and spells were often used as tools in the quest for love or control over others. Whether these were truly magical or simply symbolic acts to strengthen a relationship is still up for debate. But the fact that such practices were widespread shows just how powerful the idea of magic was in shaping courtship and romantic life. The most disturbing aspect of these trials was not just the fear of witchcraft, but the constant risk of being falsely accused and the subsequent fallout. It wasn't just that your love life could be ruined by a trial, it could end in execution. The medieval courtship process, already full of societal pressures, became a battleground of superstition and fear, where a simple misunderstanding could lead to disastrous consequences, so as if dealing with arranged marriages, public courtship, and all the other stresses wasn't enough. Imagine the danger of being caught up in a witch trial because someone didn't approve of your relationship. Romance in the Middle Ages. It was more like a game of survival than the pursuit of love. Next up, let's talk about something even more deadly than a witch trial: the dangerous mix of love and war. Yes, war had a huge impact on medieval relationships, and it wasn't just about sending soldiers off to battle. War had a way of shaping love, alliances, and even marriages in ways that were far from romantic. Let's turn the page to love and war, where things get even messier. Now, you might not think the two go together, but in the medieval world, war was often the backdrop to both marriage alliances and romantic entanglements. The Middle Ages weren't just about sword fights and castles. They were also about political maneuvering, and nothing said political alliance like a well-placed marriage. So while your love life might have been about connecting emotionally with someone, well, not really. Your marriage was probably all about securing power, land, or even military advantage. Here's where things get tricky. War didn't just tear families apart, it could create relationships. Picture this. You're a knight and you've just been part of a successful siege. You come back home, wounded but victorious, and the first thing your family does is start arranging a marriage contract. But hold up, this isn't about finding someone you love. This is about consolidating power, securing your wealth, and ensuring that your military victories are honored. The love part was secondary and, frankly, optional. But let's dig deeper. Often, marriages were formed during or after wars, not because love blossomed in the heat of battle, though that may have happened on occasion, but because alliances between rival families were cemented through marriages. The bigger the conflict, the more desperate families became to secure these political unions. The threat of war was a constant pressure that pushed people into marriages that were strategic rather than sentimental. Let's throw in a bit of tragic romance for good measure. Imagine a knight falling in love with a woman from an enemy family. Talk about a forbidden romance. You might think star-crossed lovers could make this relationship work. But in the medieval world, these stories rarely ended in happily ever afters. Most of the time, love was sacrificed for the sake of loyalty, honor, and, of course, the Crown historians still argue whether these forced alliances were more about survival or political necessity. Were people just using marriage as a tool to strengthen their military positions? Or did some genuinely find affection amidst the chaos? It's likely that both happened, but the fact remains, medieval marriages, especially those involving the nobility, were heavily shaped by the threat of war. Take the infamous 100 Years' War, for example. During this conflict, which lasted from 1337 to 1453, numerous marriages were arranged to seal alliances between French and English factions. This wasn't about romantic love, it was about securing the future of your people and ensuring your power base remained intact. And, of course, this constant clash of kingdoms meant that there were more opportunities to lose loved ones to war. Imagine being a young widow or widower after your spouse was sent off to battle and then trying to navigate the strange world of courtship and remarriage. Your grief, no matter how deep, had to take a back seat to the political pressures of the time. And let's not forget the women who were used as pawns in these grand military strategies. Nobles didn't just marry for love, they married to boost their military strength. Women were often sent to form alliances with powerful enemies, sometimes leaving behind their homes and everything they knew. Marriage was an economic exchange, one that could often involve lives being appended in the name of conquest. On the flip side, some women were known to lead in the midst of war, commanding armies or holding down fortresses while their husbands were away. The most famous example of this is Joan of Arc, who inspired armies and led the French to victory. But even her courage wasn't enough to shield her from the dangers of war and politics. Joan's life wasn't just about bravery and love for her country, it was deeply entangled with the expectations placed on her, as well as the political alliances that governed her every move. And if war wasn't enough, consider the raids, pillaging, and the general chaos that often came with warfare. Women were sometimes taken as prisoners or brides of convenience, forced into alliances with the enemy because of their beauty or status. Romantic relationships during times of conflict were often about control, with the brutal reality that love and affection took a backseat to political and military strategies. The personal tragedies of war-losing loved ones, being separated from spouses, or enduring forced marriages turned medieval love into a battlefield of its own. War brought people together, but it also tore them apart. The emotional toll of warfare on relationships was enormous, and medieval people often had to navigate love and loss in the context of violence and survival. But here's the silver lining. If you can call it that, after the war ended, marriages sometimes acted as a form of healing. For those who survived the trials, marriages offered a chance to rebuild what was lost and start anew. The tough reality was that in a world where death was often looming, relationships became a necessary anchor in times of uncertainty. It wasn't just about love, it was about ensuring family continuity and securing your place in a world constantly on the edge of chaos. Next, let's explore the rather grim concept of medieval divorce. Spoiler alert. It wasn't nearly as easy as calling it quits. Alright, let's talk about divorce, or rather, the lack of it in medieval times. If you think modern relationships are hard to navigate, imagine living in a time where marriage wasn't just a commitment. It was a lifelong sentence, and the idea of breaking that bond was as foreign as the concept of a weekend getaway. Divorce simply didn't exist in the medieval world. No irreconcilable differences. No quick and easy settlements. If you made the mistake of marrying the wrong person, you were stuck with them probably until death did you part, and often far sooner than you would have liked. In medieval Europe, the church was the ultimate authority on marriage, and its stance on divorce was clear. It wasn't going to happen. Marriage was considered a sacrament, a holy bond before God. To break that bond was essentially to defy divine authority. Divorce, in the traditional sense, was not an option. In fact, the church didn't even acknowledge the possibility that a marriage could be invalid unless the marriage vows had been made under duress, or if the marriage wasn't consummated, i.e., no sex had happened. If the marriage had been performed properly, no matter how awful the relationship, you were stuck. And given how many marriages were arranged for political or financial reasons, that meant plenty of unhappy couples had no recourse. But wait, there's a twist. While the church may have been adamant about not recognizing divorce, it wasn't entirely immune to practical concerns. Annulment, a declaration that a marriage was never valid, was possible, but it wasn't easy to get. The process of obtaining an annulment was incredibly difficult and often involved a long and detailed investigation into the legitimacy of the marriage. For example, if either party was found to be impotent, or if they had lied about a major factor in the marriage, such as being already married or having an incurable disease, an annulment might be granted. But let's be clear, annulments were rare and typically granted to the wealthy and powerful, those who could afford the lengthy process and the bribes to get what they wanted. The idea of breaking up with someone because of personal differences simply didn't fly. If your marriage was rocky, you had very few options. If you wanted out, you could be accused of adultery or desertion, which was punishable by being shunned or even excommunicated by the church. And remember, this wasn't just a personal issue. It was a social one. Divorce didn't only affect the individuals involved, it affected their families, their properties, and their standing in the community. A divorce was tantamount to declaring that you and your spouse had failed at your social contract. So what did people do when they were stuck in a bad marriage, or when they were in love with someone else? The answer is often as bleak as it sounds. They cheated. Infidelity was widespread, but it wasn't always punished equally. Men, especially those of higher status, could often get away with affairs, while women were heavily scrutinized for even the slightest hint of wrongdoing. Adultery could lead to public humiliation or punishment. But it wasn't necessarily the end of the world, less of course. You were caught with someone from a different social class, or your actions affected your family's honor. Historians still debate how much cheating was tolerated in the medieval world. Some argue that it was common among the nobility, particularly since marriages were often about power and not love. For the lower classes, however, infidelity might have been more difficult to hide and more severely punished. In either case, infidelity often wasn't the direct cause of a marriage's end, but it certainly could exacerbate the problems that led to dissatisfaction in the first place. As we're talking about all of this, let's not forget the nuns and monks who, for different reasons, avoided marriage altogether. These religious communities were, in many ways, an alternative to the strictures of marriage. The idea of living a celibate life for religious reasons was seen as a higher calling, and many chose that route to avoid the misanthropes of medieval relationships. But even those who lived outside the traditional marital structure faced their own set of challenges, especially when the church scrutinized their every move. So, while the idea of a happy marriage might have seemed appealing, the medieval reality was much more about endurance than bliss. The lack of a true divorce system meant that most people had to find a way to make it work, or at least pretend that they were happy, because the alternative could be far worse than a lifetime spent in an unhappy marriage. And now, as we wrap up this miserable tale of medieval romance, let's look at the final tragedy in this story: marriage as property rights. Relationships weren't just about love or companionship, they were about ownership. And when marriage became less about partnership and more about property, it made the whole idea of love seem downright tragic. And now, let's dive into the uncomfortable truth about medieval marriage as property rights. If you thought medieval relationships were strictly about love or companionship, you're about to be sorely disappointed. For most of the population, marriage wasn't a romantic union, it was a business transaction. When families arranged marriages, it wasn't about finding someone with whom you could share your life. It was about securing property, status, and alliances. The woman was often seen as the property of her father until the moment she was handed over to her husband. In the eyes of the law and society, she wasn't much more than a transactional asset. Imagine that. You are a woman in medieval times. You've been raised to be a dutiful daughter, learning how to run a household, manage servants, and take care of children. Then, one day, your father arranges your marriage. He doesn't ask you if you like the man you're going to marry. He doesn't even check if you're emotionally ready. All that matters is the family's wealth, status, and whether or not this union will benefit the family line. In essence, you are bought by your future husband, who pays a dowry to your father, and you are handed over like any other asset. You were expected to be loyal, bear children, and manage the home while your husband focused on politics, war, or business. Love that was more of a luxury that few could afford. Marriage was about securing land, wealth, and the continuation of family name and power. In the lower classes, this dynamic was still present, but with less pomp and circumstance. People of lower social standing didn't have the luxury of huge dowries, but the transaction was just as real. The poor were often forced to marry in order to secure their livelihoods or maintain their status. If you didn't marry, you were seen as a failure, socially, economically, and morally. This harsh reality was often driven by the belief that a person's worth was linked to their ability to produce heirs, manage property, and contribute to the family's economic survival. Now, let's talk about the husband's property. After marriage, a wife was often considered the property of her husband. While women could sometimes have property or land of their own before marriage, once the marriage vows were taken, everything became part of the husband's estate. If the husband died, everything property, wealth, even the children passed under the control of his family. This left many women in precarious situations, especially if they didn't have a substantial dowry or any independent wealth to fall back on. Some women even found themselves locked in abusive marriages because they had no legal recourse to leave and no way to support themselves outside of the marriage. You'd think the wealthy would have a little more freedom in their romantic decisions, but they faced their own complications. For the upper classes, marriages were often about political alliances, with heirs and property playing a huge part. Marrying for love, that was considered almost naive romance, was secondary to the preservation of wealth. This is where the practice of arranged marriages flourished. The emotional connection between spouses was not a priority. Instead, families arranged marriages based on the need for status, land acquisition, and military alliances. But it wasn't all bleak for the rich. Wealthy women did sometimes have a bit more agency when it came to choosing their spouses, but even then, the choice was often more about ensuring the right social standing and inheritance rights. Men, on the other hand, had the upper hand in these relationships. They were the ones who controlled family decisions, including marriage. Women in these arrangements were often treated as property, their lives and futures decided by their father, husband, or other male relatives. Historians still debate the extent to which love and romantic feelings could evolve within these rigid frameworks. Some argue that over time, relationships between couples became more affectionate and emotionally invested. Others suggest that romantic love was simply a fantasy for the noble class, an idealized concept that had little basis in medieval life. The reality for most was that marriage wasn't a partnership of equals, it was an arrangement for survival, wealth, and power. And here's the kicker: divorce wasn't an option, but separation often was, if you could afford it. But separation didn't come with the emotional freedom you'd hope for. It simply meant a physical distance between you and your spouse, often without any hope of remarrying. Widows had more freedom in some cases, but even then, their control over property was limited, and their options for remarriage were often constrained by social expectations. As strange as it seems, this transactional marriage system actually provided some benefits in a world that was focused on survival. For the poor, marriage could be a lifeline. For the rich, it was a means of consolidating power and wealth. But what it certainly wasn't was a romantic adventure filled with hearts and roses. Medieval marriage wasn't a meeting of minds or souls, it was a business contract. Next, we'll take a closer look at the tragic love affairs that still managed to happen, despite all the rules and systems trying to keep them down. Because even in the harshest of environments, love managed to find its way, though often in the darkest of ways. As we've seen, medieval romance wasn't built on warm candlelight dinners or cute stolen glances. Love, as we know it, was often drowned out by duty, politics, and survival. But despite the rigid structures and harsh realities, tragic love affairs still managed to spark. In a world dominated by arranged marriages and the notion of property rights, it's almost a miracle that anything resembling true affection could even take root. Yet, the heart wants what it wants, even in the most desperate of circumstances. Let's start with the idea of forbidden love, something that still exists in the world of romance today, but was much more dangerous back then. Imagine being part of a powerful family, only to fall for someone from a completely different social class, family, or even political side. For noble women, this could mean a marriage to someone beneath their station or a secret affair with a knight or commoner, both of which could lead to exile, disinheritance, or worse. But, as with any forbidden love, the passion was what made it dangerous. These relationships were fraught with risk, but they were also often more intense and passionate than those arranged by families. In some cases, these love affairs ended in death, usually the death of the lovers, and often tragic or violent. There was little room for quiet, subtle love in the medieval world. If the affair was found out, it would be either publicly condemned or violently broken up. One of the most famous examples of tragic medieval love involves the legendary story of Tristan and Isolde, a tale of love doomed from the start. Tristan, a knight, and Isolde, the promised bride of King Mark, fall in love after an illicit affair that involves a magical love potion. The story ends in death and separation, with both lovers losing everything he sold at her life and Tristan his honor and future. The theme of forbidden love echoed through the literature and stories of the time, providing both a source of escapism for the people and a grim reminder of how love could never truly escape the societal forces surrounding it. Historians still argue whether stories like Tristan and Isolde were mere romanticized fiction or reflections of real-life events. Some believe these tales were based on the emotional struggles and loves of real people who lived in medieval courts, while others suggest that these stories were exaggerated fantasies, designed to entertain the masses with tales of love that transcended the social rules. But this wasn't just about knights and ladies locked in towers. Common folk too faced tragic love stories, though often with far grimmer endings. For peasants and those of lower status, love didn't come with grand gestures or magical potions. It was about survival, and often societal norms dictated their romantic choices. The consequences of a forbidden affair could be far worse. Imagine sneaking around with someone from a higher social rank, or even being caught in a clandestine relationship when your family had already promised you to someone else. The humiliation could lead to your banishment from the village, or worse, execution. There's a particularly dark story about Elena da Casta, a noblewoman from Italy who fell in love with a commoner. Their relationship was discovered, and not only did she lose her position and wealth, but she was imprisoned for her defiance of the social structure. In the end, their love was not only forbidden, but brutally crushed by the harsh social norms of the time. Then there were the cases of unrequited love, where a knight or nobleman would be deeply infatuated with a lady who was either married or too high in status to be one. Think of the chivalric Coda knight's undying loyalty to his lady, even if she never returned his affections. This idealized form of love, where the knight pledges eternal devotion despite rejection, was popularized in literature. But in reality, it was often the cause of emotional torment for those involved. One particularly famous tale involves Theodoric of the North, a knight who dedicated his entire life to a lady who never reciprocated his feelings. His obsession with her, paired with her indifference, drove him mad with grief and eventually led him to self-destruction. Stories like these were common in medieval literature, but it's likely that they mirrored real experiences of men and women suffering from relationships that couldn't fulfill their emotional needs, especially when those relationships were governed by harsh societal expectations. Forbidden love wasn't just about secret affairs. It was about the painful realization that love in the medieval world wasn't a simple matter of affection. It was complex, often toxic, and always influenced by the structures of power, class, and religion. The tragic endings, deaths, suicides, and broken families were frequent, and the idea of a happy ending was often reserved for the most idealized stories or, quite frankly, fairy tales that didn't always reflect the brutal reality of medieval life. In this world of power, struggles, and emotional turmoil, romance was often just a fleeting distraction, something that existed mostly in stories or fleeting moments of stolen glances, but rarely in the lives of the people who were trapped in the systems that kept them from living freely. But even in these dire situations, love found a way to creep in, whether through a secret affair or a forbidden glance across the crowded courtyard. And just when you thought things couldn't get any worse, let's dive into the final blow. Marriage as a property right? That's right. Even in the world of tragic romance, love and courtship were often reduced to a simple matter of properties, something we'll explore in our next section. As we've seen, medieval love wasn't just about roses and whispered promises. Love was deeply entangled with property rights, a concept that reduced marriage to little more than an economic transaction, whether you were nobility or a peasant. The reality of medieval marriage was that it was often viewed as the transfer of assets between two families, rather than the union of two people in love. Let's break it down. When a nobleman married a woman, what he was really doing was acquiring. Property. His new wife wasn't just a partner. She was the bearer of dowries and land, a means to secure his position in the social hierarchy. For the bride's family, it was often a matter of safeguarding their legacy. The dowry wasn't a small gesture. It was the woman's contribution to the marriage, meant to compensate the groom's family for the cost of marrying her. A wealthy dowry could make a woman highly desirable, but a poor one might leave her stuck with a less than desirable match. For women in this system, ownership wasn't just about wealth or property. In many cases, it was about relinquishing control. Once married, a woman's property, whether it was land, livestock, or goods, became the property of her husband. She didn't have control over her own assets, let alone her own future. While she might manage the household and children, legally, she was little more than an extension of her husband's wealth. And if he passed away, well, in many cases, his wealth, including her dowry, went directly to his male heirs. This could leave a widow in dire straits, especially if there were no inheritance provisions in place. The idea that marriage equaled property extended far beyond the wealthier classes. Even in poorer regions, marriage was about creating a union that would help sustain families. Property rights were essential to survival in medieval society, and the matrimonial contract was essentially a way of securing those rights. If your family had land or assets, it was likely that your marriage would be arranged to help maintain or expand that wealth. Love, of course, was secondary to the exchange of property. This isn't to say that all marriages were devoid of affection, but the reality was that many couples didn't have the freedom to fall in love, and the choice of a spouse was less about emotional connection than it was about economic necessity. If you were part of the lower class, your best option was often an arranged marriage that ensured your family's survival. For the upper classes, marriages were strategic, based on political alliances and the desire to maintain or increase wealth. Marriage was also essential for producing heirs, ensuring that the family's wealth and land were passed down. For men, securing an heir was often the most important goal of marriage. Women, as the bearers of children, had their primary function defined by their ability to produce sons, ensuring that the property and wealth would be handed down to future generations. If a woman failed to produce heirs, her position in the marriage could be jeopardized and her status reduced. In addition to this transactional view of marriage, the concept of inheritance was heavily tied to patrilineal lines. The inheritance of property typically followed the father's lineage, and daughters, though important for maintaining family alliances, had to marry out in order to ensure that the family's wealth remained intact. This practice didn't leave much room for personal choice, and women were often married off to the highest bidder, even though marriage in medieval times was often about survival. It wasn't without its complications. The system that reduced women to property created numerous challenges for men and women alike. For men, inheritance laws sometimes meant they would have to marry to secure their lineage. But if a woman didn't bring the right dowry or failed to produce an heir, it could create a great deal of tension. And for women, the lack of legal rights within marriage created an environment where personal agency was virtually non-existent. So, while the idea of a romantic marriage was nearly impossible for most people, the harsh reality of medieval property rights created a rigid and often painful system, where marriage was much more about land and wealth than about the two people involved. Now, let's turn to a different kind of love disaster, the royal courtship, where the rules of marriage were governed not only by politics, but by the expectations of dynastic power. In royal circles, marriages were the ultimate form of diplomacy, one that could make or break an entire kingdom. Now, let's step into the glittering, yet treacherous world of royal courtships, a realm where marriages weren't just about love, but about dynasty, power, and alliances. When it came to kings, queens, and nobles, love was rarely the driving Force behind marriage. These unions were political tools used to forge alliances, maintain peace, and secure the throne. The concept of romantic love didn't even factor in for most royals. What mattered was how a marriage would affect the future of the kingdom. In the world of royalty, marriage was the ultimate diplomatic weapon. Consider how Queen Isabella of Castile and King Ferdinand of Aragon's marriage forged a unified Spain, ending centuries of territorial conflict. This union wasn't about love. It was about securing the future of the Spanish kingdom, with both rulers joining forces to expel the Moors and expand their influence in Europe. Marriage was simply the most effective tool in their political arsenal. The idea of royal marriage as a diplomatic tool didn't stop at creating peace. It was also a way to secure heirs, solidifying royal bloodlines. When you're dealing with kingdoms, your family tree is the most valuable asset. If your union doesn't produce an heir, you're not just facing marital strife, you're potentially facing a dynastic crisis. These marriages were often contracted years in advance, and the bride and groom may have never even met before the wedding. Princess Margaret Tudor of England, for instance, was married to King James IV of Scotland at the age of just 13. Not because they were in love, but because it was a political move to unite the two countries. Let's not forget the personal toll these royal marriages took on those involved. If you were a royal, love was far from your first concern. Take Catherine of Aragon, whose marriage to King Henry VIII of England was intended to strengthen ties with Spain. She was a loyal wife, dutiful and noble, yet her husband's infatuation with another woman, Anne Boleyn, led to the separation of the Church of England from Rome. Henry's desperate desire for a male heir overshadowed any regard for Catherine's feelings. Catherine was not only forced to endure the pain of betrayal, but was later publicly humiliated when she was divorced in favor of Anne. And don't even get me started on marriage within royal families. While many royal unions were political, the inbreeding that resulted from too many royal families intermarrying in an effort to keep the bloodlines pure led to a slew of genetic problems. Take the Habsburg dynasty, for example. Their obsession with maintaining blood purity resulted in a marriage between Philip of Burgundy and Joanna of Castile, who were both great-grandchildren of the same royal couple. This led to a series of genetic disorders in their children, most notably Habsburg jaw, a condition that caused facial deformities. If you think your family reunions are awkward, imagine being the product of generations of royal inbreeding. Royal marriages were often arranged with the clear goal of securing power, whether that was increasing territorial holdings, ensuring political stability, or solidifying alliances. Love wasn't even on the radar. These unions were contracts, as cold and calculated as any business deal. For the average person, the idea of romantic love might have seemed like an unattainable fantasy, but for the royals, marriage was a constant reminder that duty came before personal desires. To marry for love in royal circles was an exception, not the rule. But let's not forget about the horrors that awaited those who were forced into marriage against their will. While some royals might have been able to form alliances and secure power through marriage, others suffered under the weight of a union they didn't choose. Think of Princess Charlotte of Wales, whose arranged marriage to Prince Leopold of Saxe-Coburg was, for all intents and purposes, a political move to consolidate power. Yet, this marriage was deeply unhappy for Charlotte, who eventually died in childbirth, leaving behind a legacy of unfulfilled potential and a deep, lasting sadness for the royal family. Historians still debate the psychological and emotional toll these arranged royal marriages took on those involved. Did they suffer in silence, knowing their personal happiness was a distant dream? Or did they find some measure of satisfaction in playing their part to maintain royal power? It's likely a mix of both, as some royals seemed to find comfort in their roles, while others quietly withered under the pressure. Some found solace in affairs, while others became disillusioned with the whole idea of royal duty. The personal sacrifices made in these marriages can't be overstated. The emotional toll of knowing your marriage was politically arranged, not born of affection, often led to deep sadness, depression, and a sense of powerlessness. While some royals were able to maneuver within the strict confines of their marriages, others felt trapped in a gilded cage. Their every action scrutinized by their families, the public, and even the state, as we leave behind the royal marriages that were formed for power. We'll take a look at what happened to the common folk, who faced even more restrictions in their relationships, except their problems were far more personal and far less glamorous. Let's talk about the dangers of love in the world of medieval peasants. While the royals were busy making power plays with their arranged marriages, the lives of common folk in the medieval period were hardly any less dramatic or difficult when it came to matters of the heart. For the average peasant, a romantic relationship wasn't about love, but about survival. Even though peasants didn't have the political power that royals wielded, their marriages were still deeply influenced by economic needs, social expectations, and sometimes harsh social punishments. Let's start with the reality that, for peasants, marriage often wasn't even a personal choice. Much like their wealthier counterparts, arranged marriages were a way to secure survival. You didn't marry for affection or love. You married to work the land, to produce heirs to work alongside you, and to solidify your social standing. If you were lucky, you might marry for some level of companionship, but even that was far from guaranteed. If your marriage was about anything, it was about pragmatic considerations. Could you farm together? Could you share the workload of life? In a small medieval village, could you produce enough heirs to help with the chores? In fact, the marriage of a common person wasn't even really a private affair. It was a public obligation. Neighbors were watching, and everyone was waiting to see if you'd live up to your duties, producing children, managing the farm, and maintaining the family name. There was very little room for emotional expression. If a marriage didn't produce heirs, or worse, if it failed to meet the community's expectations, it wasn't just a personal disappointment. It was a community failure. For women, the situation was even more complicated. They weren't just expected to run a household. They were also the primary childbearers and were responsible for raising the next generation of workers. Without the ability to work in a field or contribute economically, a woman was essentially useless in the eyes of the community. So if a woman didn't marry, she was often left to a life of hardship or the village's disdain. In many cases, unmarried women were forced to live as servants or were ostracized, which led many women to settle into marriages that weren't based on any emotional connection. But even for those who found partners in these pragmatic arrangements, life wasn't a walk in the park. Premarital sex, for example, was often punished with public shame, fines, or even physical punishment, depending on your social class. This wasn't a time for dating apps or slow-burn romance. If you weren't officially married and were caught engaging in sexual activity, there were serious consequences. Sometimes, this even led to public floggings or being forced to marry the person you were accused of being with, often leading to very unhappy unions, especially for the woman involved. So much for love at first sight. Adultery in the peasant world was no less harsh. If a husband or wife was caught being unfaithful, they could face public shaming, and in some cases, it was a matter of life or death. In many communities, infidelity was considered a betrayal, not just of your spouse, but of the community. The impact on children could be devastating, and the repercussions often lasted long after the affair was discovered. Punishments could range from being forced to undergo a public confession to being excommunicated by the church. Yet, despite all these hardships, there were some who managed to find love, however fleeting or hidden it may have been. In some of the rare moments of freedom away from the watchful eyes of the community, there were peasants who fell for one another. These clandestine relationships were often sparked during times of leisure festivals, village gatherings, or working in the fields, but the risk of getting caught was high. And even the smallest indiscretion could result in severe punishment. Historians still debate the nature of romantic affection. Among peasants during the medieval period, some argue that the lack of privacy and constant surveillance made genuine romantic relationships almost impossible. Others believe that, despite all the constraints, common people did indeed form emotional connections, often making the best out of a marriage. That was more about survival than passion. One of the key aspects of medieval peasant marriages was the overwhelming influence of religion. Marriage wasn't just a social contract. It was a sacred act that tied you to the church. And that meant that marital fidelity and the sanctity of marriage were deeply ingrained in the community's values. However, despite the church's influence on the institution of marriage, peasants were often seldom able to uphold the ideal of marital sanctity. The high mortality rates, especially during periods of war, plague, and famine, meant that widowhood was a common fate for many women, and remarriage was often the only way to secure survival. For men, remarriage could often be an opportunity to find another productive partner, but for women, it meant another potential relationship rooted in survival rather than personal desire. If you were a widow with land or property, you had some power, but if you were without resources, your second marriage often didn't offer much more than a chance to survive. So, while love may have been part of the equation for some peasants, it was, for the most part, a rare luxury. For most, marriage was just another social and economic obligation, one that came with huge consequences if it was broken. Next, let's move into a much darker territory, the lasting impact of medieval marriage on the generations that followed. How did all these challenges and power struggles affect the long-term development of relationships? As we near the end of our journey through medieval romance, it's time to look at the lasting impact these harsh marriage systems had on future generations. The structures of medieval marriage weren't just about the individuals involved. They shaped entire generations, influencing how people approached relationships, love, and personal agency for centuries to come. If you think about the centuries of marriage as property, family alliances, and political negotiations, it's no wonder that love and affection were seen as luxuries reserved for only a few. The medieval model of arranged marriage became entrenched in the social fabric of society, influencing how marriage was viewed even in later periods. The concept that marriage was about family alliances and the economic contract between two families permeated beyond the medieval period and bled into the Renaissance and early modern eras. The idea of marriage as a transaction lingered for centuries, especially among the upper classes, even as we moved into the more modern times. The importance of love in marriage was still a slow development, with many unions continuing to be more about securing property, social standing, or maintaining political control for the common folk. The impact of medieval marriage traditions created a lasting culture of survival-based relationships. As we've seen, marriage for peasants was often about securing economic stability and ensuring the survival of the family unit. The idea of marrying for love was almost an afterthought. This economic approach to relationships shaped the way future generations viewed partnership. Many people still felt the pressure to form unions based on security, not affection. Even today, marriage is still sometimes seen by many as a social contract that extends beyond the emotional or romantic bond. The notion of gender roles in medieval marriage had its own ripple effects on later generations. Women in the Middle Ages were often treated as propedia reality that continued well into the modern era. Women's roles in marriage were dictated by their ability to bear children, run households, and bring dowries. These pressures were so ingrained in medieval society that they continued to shape attitudes toward women's roles in marriage up until the 20th century. Women's ability to own property or have financial autonomy was restricted, and often, marriage was seen as the only way for women to gain status in society. This pattern of economic dependency continued long after the medieval period and even led to marriage laws that favored men over women well into the steered 1900s. Even more troubling was the legacy of social control embedded in medieval marriage systems, the punishments for infidelity, the pressure to marry for reasons other than love, and the lack of personal choice set a precedent for relationships that were more about control than mutual affection. This pattern contributed to social expectations that still linger in certain parts of the world today. Marriage as a means of social control didn't just disappear, remained woven into the fabric of societal expectations, shaping how relationships were viewed in various cultures for centuries. But what about the emotional toll of these marriages? The medieval practice of marrying for security often meant that personal happiness and emotional connection were sacrificed. This left generations of people, especially women, feeling trapped in loveless marriages. Although many adapted to the harsh realities, the idea that a person could feel emotionally unfulfilled in a marriage was a heavy burden carried by generations. Emotional neglect and the suppression of affection became normal, especially when marriage was just a business arrangement or a political contract. The deep sense of emotional deprivation during the medieval period echoed through future relationships, creating generations of people who were emotionally disconnected from their partners. Many individuals still found ways to connect emotionally, but the pressure to marry for reasons outside of love created lasting resentment and estrangement in relationships. This generational pattern took years to undo, with modern relationships still struggling with the remnants of medieval ideas about marriage. But there's hope. Slowly over time, the idea of love and marriage became more prominent, even if it was originally seen as a luxury for the wealthy. The idea of romantic love gradually took hold during the Renaissance and later periods, with more and more people choosing their spouses based on affection rather than duty or social contracts. Romanticism in literature, the rise of individualism, and the spread of new ideas about personal happiness began to shape modern understandings of relationships. Still, even today, echoes of the medieval marriage system can be felt in arranged marriages in certain cultures. And the economic aspects of relationships are still alive and well in many parts of the world. As we wrap up, it's clear that the impact of medieval marriage traditions wasn't just confined to the past. It has shaped the way we view relationships, power, gender, and social structure up to the present day. The long-standing legacies of marriage as property and economic necessity continue to affect our understanding of romantic relationships and family dynamics. While love has slowly come to the forefront, it took centuries of revolutionary change to shift marriage into something more personal, meaningful, and, at times, even romantic. Now, as we close the door on this medieval journey, let's take a deep breath and look back. The world of medieval dating and marriage was filled with challenges, harsh expectations, and complex power dynamics, but it also set the stage for the more complex emotional relationships we navigate today. As we reach the final chapter of this medieval journey, let's take a moment to reflect on how all these rigid and often heartbreaking rules about medieval romance and marriage have shaped the world we live in today. It's hard to imagine. But everything from arranged marriages to property exchanges and courtly love laid the groundwork for the modern concept of relationships. We may have evolved, and love may now be seen as a personal choice. But many of the ideas surrounding relationships, power, and family still echo through the ages. So, while your 21st century dating life might seem complicated, it's nothing compared to what medieval couples had to endure. Marriage in medieval times wasn't just about finding a partner to share your life with. It was about navigating survival, social expectations, economic necessity, and, often, religious control. If you lived in the Middle Ages, your future, your happiness, and even your personal agency were determined by forces far beyond your control. Love wasn't even part of the equation for most. It was just a small part of an overwhelming set of obligations that took precedence over any emotional needs. For the men and women of medieval times, love was often something that had to be earned through sacrifice, submission, and duty, not something that came easily, nor something you could take for granted. The social norms of the time ensured that you didn't have a lot of freedom when it came to choosing your partner, and the consequences for breaking those norms were harsh. In a world where everything was transactional, whether it was your dowry, your social status, or your bloodline, marriage was a necessary structure designed to maintain order, not to foster intimacy. But despite these barriers, love did find a way to sneak through the cracks. Forbidden romances, secret affairs, and tragic love stories made their mark, often leaving behind stories that would survive the ages. The stories of Tristan and Isolde, Romeo and Juliet, and countless others emerged from a world where love was complicated by the structures of power, but where the desire for affection, connection, and companionship never truly died. As we look back on this world, it's easy to see how much has changed, yet how much still remains the same. Today, while many of the laws surrounding marriage and courtship have evolved, the power dynamics at play are often still rooted in centuries of societal tradition. Even today, the remnants of these ancient marriage practices can still be seen in arranged marriages, social expectations around gender roles, and the sometimes complicated connection between romantic love and economic necessity. And as we slowly ease into the modern world, it's clear that love, while a more central force in relationships, still shaped by forces we can't always control. Whether it's family pressure, financial circumstances, or cultural expectations, relationships are still about more than just two individuals coming together. They're about society, history, and the legacy of countless generations. So what have we learned from this deep dive into medieval romance? Maybe it's this: no matter how complicated or challenging love may seem, whether in the medieval era or today, we all seek the same basic thing: the ability to connect. Perhaps it's the struggle for that connection, the barriers we face, and the choices we make that define us as humans. And that's something that has always stayed the same. Now, as you slip into a deeper sleep, feel the weight of this historical journey soften, and know that romance, in all its forms, has been navigating this complex road for centuries. Whether medieval or modern, love, in its rawest and most purest form, always finds a way through, no matter the obstacles.